Hello and welcome to another episode of Transformational Blueprints, where we try to put a dent in the large number of transformation programs that fail. Hosted by me, Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group. On this series, we will bring you unique insights drawn from first-hand experience from some of the most high-profile architecture and transformation leaders across the globe. Topics told in order to share knowledge, experiences, and ideas to inspire, innovate, and give back to the architecture community. So grab a coffee, sit back, and relax. Welcome, everybody. Today, we are going to be talking to Ste Naden about what is the role of a chief architect. Ste has worked in the IT industry for over 28 years, undertaking architecture roles for 25 of those and chief architect roles for over half that time as well. Whilst at Fujitsu, he worked across multiple industry sectors, but gained significant experience in working with high complex, critical national infrastructure customers, such as the Home Office and other critical government departments. The last 5.5 years, he spent working for a business called Calyx on creating products and services, empowering the clinical trials sector, including through the COVID pandemic. This also involves significant transformation of the business, both divestiture from a parent company, M&A growth, and transformation of all products and services into Azure and the journey to SaaS-based offerings. He's also really passionate about growing the maturity of good ways of working, process and practices across the industry, and has been involved in a driver's seat in driving these, being involved in the Open Group, as an ex-president of SEMAT, working with thought leaders to define a common way to break out of the method prisons and move towards use of good, repeatable practices to drive higher quality outcomes. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. So always a good place to start, Steve. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, of course. So I, like a lot of probably people in the technical sector, I started by joining Fujitsu actually as a graduate, and I started as a coder, a developer. I was always quite passionate into design and so on, but when you first start, nobody lets you do that type of stuff early doors. So I started as a developer, and then basically worked my way up. So it's a fairly standard sort of model, really. I started as a developer. I then became sort of a lead developer and therefore started taking on a bit of design. I then moved into my first sort of architecture type roles. And because I'd come from a coding background, it was an application architect doing that. And then it's the usual way of things, I think, in a lot of people. You learn, well, I'm designing an application. It needs to talk to other things. So you have to learn networking. You have to learn APIs. You learn about doing it in a secure way. So you have to learn about security. You have to learn about this. You have to learn about information management. And slowly your breadth grows, and you therefore start taking the bigger and wider picture. And as I sort of moved up, took on more interesting roles, more wider roles, got more involved with customer conversations. And before I knew it, I was doing a lot of business type architecture and capability as well. And then moving into that sort of way of doing that wider across the business and across the industry type conversations in terms of doing it too. So it's been a gradual build up of add a bit of skill, go from what we probably a lot of people call an I-shaped person into a T-shaped person as more breadth and more knowledge and more capability comes in place. And they're sort of just developing in that type of model in terms of where it actually is.
Okay. That makes sense. And we've spoken on this podcast about the I shape and the impact that can have on someone's career by getting that breadth early doors and then focusing on something. What do you think makes a great architect in today's world then? Quite intrigued.
I think it's about a few things. One is you need to not fall into the ivory tower architecture type way of things. So you need to understand the shape of the market. The real architect's role is to understand where you're actually going as a business, understand what the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and look at how you can pull those things together to be able to achieve those things as well, with a pragmatic view of the skills of the team, the capability of the team, and so on as well, and be able to work that forward. But at the same time, I always say the architect's role is to really own the non-functionals in the capability. While you have the BAs and the people there understanding the functionality, where it's going, the architect's job is to keep an eye on, can it scale? Is it secure? And bring those type of knowledge into there as well in a pragmatic way. You know, there's no point saying this is a perfect architecture model, this is a perfect design model, and you don't have the people to do it. It's too far from where your product set is at the moment. So that pragmatic view, but they're keeping the eye on the big picture and all of those non-functionals at the same time.
Okay, that makes sense. So basically a visionary, being able to look into the future and predict what's going to happen and make sure that, you know, the technology can support that. Okay, again, just for a bit of context, before we dive into the conversation, tell us a little bit about your time at Calyx, you know, size of the team, what the business did, and so on.
Yeah, so it's probably a company nobody has heard of if you don't work in the sector. What it does is it classifies itself as a technically enabled services company, and it provides services into the big pharmaceuticals and the biotech companies of the world for actually managing clinical trials and all the regulatory type of information which needs to be stored and managed throughout that process. And, you know, I don't probably have to talk through the detail of it for people to realize it's quite complicated in terms of what can actually be done there, and data is really key. I joined there at an interesting time. At the time, we were part of a parent company called Par Excel, and in that time, we had at the time I joined, we had a set of products which were quite traditional products. You know, we actually shipped them to customers, not quite on CD, but in that type of model, and we did a transformation of first taking all of our products, moving them into the cloud, moving them into and also transforming them into sort of a SaaS type provision. So we were providing a service to our customers, and we could actually take that. And the journey needed to actually do that transformation. We also went through a process of, as I said, we were part of a parent company, and we divested from there. We made a case to the investors that actually we would be better separated from them, simply because of then where the investment cycle would be in our products and our capabilities in there as well. And then there was a number of transformations where, as we then looked at that, we went, well, actually, what products in our portfolio don't make sense as we go forward, and we want to divest, and actually the process of selling and in convincing people that, and also going, how do we invest? How do we actually bring it in? What that meant is I built an architecture practice. We had architects there when we joined, but we actually created an architecture team, a focus, a career structure in there. In general running, we had about 25-ish architects across a number of different domains and verticals and product alignment in there. But I think our biggest point, we had about 50. And we had about 50 in there when we were doing things like the transformation of moving away from our parent company, where we had to build our own data centers, we had to build out our own business systems, we had to build out all of that other stuff and do transition into cloud and all of those major changes. You know, we had to ramp up because we had to do it quickly in a time scale and so on as well. So therefore, that structure, career structure, how we actually did it, the process, the method was really, really important that I helped put in place, and actually then we drove it to actually make it a success.
And how did you structure the team then, whilst we're talking about the team over at Calyx? What was it, you know, for somebody who is looking at setting up an architecture practice, or is looking at their practice and it's, you know, not delivering the value that they want? What was the structure over there, and what roles and responsibilities were sort of critical to the success of the practice?
So I think it's always important, you know, so myself as a chief architect is an enterprise architect. I look across the whole piece in there as well. But you need people at different levels looking at different bits and pieces as well. And I always look at the architecture team as a bit of a mesh structure in terms of where it goes. So you have the vertical architects in there, where I had guys who were architects dedicated to each of the products, and and not just each of the products in terms of product development, but also then the selling of each of those products as well. I.e., if you like, a solution architects who could then shape the product into a customer landscape and actually make that work in terms of how that would go as well. And also then we had some specialist infrastructure and cloud architects who were looking at how sort of that baseline information would work. But against that, also then building out, so that's quite clear usually. You have verticals, you have products, you have a number of architects you put per product and per sales cycle, and you work with the engineering leads and the sales leads to work that out. But then you need to have the horizontal structure as well, which I call the domain architects in there too. So these are the guys who are specialists, either security, service, information, and data in there as well. So therefore, those guys, which you can't afford to have per product, per capability, and you also want to have consistency across your entire portfolio in there too. So they're SMEs working with those functions in delivering those, then working with the vertical architects to actually do it. So therefore, how you link in a standard security capability or how you start linking a standard service linkage then works in terms of that mesh and that capability.
Okay, that makes sense. And then where does enterprise sit above that? Oh, sorry, does enterprise sit above that?
Yeah, absolutely. So then enterprise sits above that. So from an enterprise architecture point of view, you're touching all of those points in there as well in terms of looking at the big picture type view in terms of where that fits. So then I sort of covered that with a deputy as well, just making sure that we actually covered off that whole space in terms of did it all make sense in terms of how it sort of fitted together.
Okay. The divestiture from Parexel was huge, as you described it, and it obviously had its reasons. We don't necessarily need to go into that. But from an architecture perspective, what were the major architectural challenges you encountered during that process?
I think there's always several when you're doing this, and it's always looking where it is. So I'd say the first bit is, look, if you're divesting, you have customers. You're not starting from new. It's almost like setting up a startup, and it was almost a startup for 2,000 people. But at the same time, I think one of my colleagues described it as it trying to change the wings on a plane while it's flying, because of course you can't actually hurt your customers. You can't break the service, especially when you're in a clinical situation, a highly regulated situation that we are. So a lot of the work we did was, yes, we had to set up a new data center. Yes, we had to set up a new cloud tenant. Yes, we had to move all of these things and put the things in place architecturally to do it. But the really big bit is how do you do that transformation in such a way that you have minimal impact to the business and to your customers as you actually do them. So that how do you do a data transfer and not lose, and A, make sure you don't lose any of the data, B, make sure you have a very minimal downtime if you have to have it, or a good cut across. And also you can find models which may not be optimum for you, but are models which allow your customer to have minimal impact of what they need to change in terms of where you do it as well. And then the last thing to add to that is, and I've already said it multiple times, it was a very regulated business. So therefore, you had to make sure you stayed within the regulation, you double checked it at all points in time, and you weren't breaking that, especially with data integrity and data capability and loss. We had to make sure that was absolutely solid in terms of where it actually was.
So you had no real second chances, did you? If you're a startup, you probably got a number of customers that you can try things out, maybe fail. You can control the narrative, I suppose. But if you're already out there, you've already got a bunch of customers. You can't. There's no real room for failure, which I suppose brings its own challenge.
Absolutely, and especially in the business that we're in, where there's in the pharmaceutical thing, there's some mega beasts of companies. Everybody knows who they are, and they bring lots of money to companies. And if you mess up with them and they want to work with you for a period of time, that's a significant revenue stream you have killed, and you've really harmed the business.
Yeah. Okay. Why do you believe architecture is crucial for successful transformations? And I say successful transformations because the majority are unsuccessful, according to whatever Forbes, BCG, Gartner, whatever the statistics are. But why do you believe architecture in particular is crucial to deliver successful transformations?
I think it's sort of underpinning some of the stuff I've just said, to be honest with you, is really, you need to work backwards for a transformation to be successful. I.e., you have to go to, well, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? How do we get there? How do we make sure we've transformed, our data's solid, it's moved, we've not had downtime, and actually work that back. And I think where the architecture comes into place is being able to put all of those moving parts together and understand, when we do this, these are the things which are needed, and that's why we need to do it in this step at this point in time in order to actually do it in there. Why you still need, that engineering capability and project management and so on to do the steps in there, and that's really vital in there. If you just start down the path of doing, you will find yourself in a cul-de-sac really, really quickly and go, oh God, I wish we didn't do that, or I wish if we'd only thought about that beforehand. So it's a bit like a game of chess in terms of you have to be thinking 5, 6, 7, 8 moves ahead of what's the situation you need to get to. So the move you do next isn't going to make it more difficult for you in terms of where you go. And that's a way of architecture thinking of these are the steps we will do. Even if it doesn't start by putting the full meat on the bone, at least it gives you that framework, that capability of these are what we need to do and why we need to do it, and convince people that these are the steps. Why?
Okay. But the challenge you've got with that is, and I know, having recruited from a talent perspective, is most technology leaders see architecture, whether this is right or wrong, as a bit of, if we're going to trim any fat, it's going to be the architects, because the engineers can do a bit of architecture, or those people over there can do the architecture. So how do you, going into a transformation program, demonstrate the value a good architecture practice can be? What tangible impact, I suppose, we can talk about it from Calyx's perspective. What tangible impact did the architecture practice have on Calyx's business operations against their strategic goals, which is the whole purpose of architecture, right?
Yeah. So again, it's about making sure that you actually get that guarantee in place in terms of where you're actually going. So, again, in that regulated type industry, it's how can we make sure we are not losing data? How can we make sure we're not actually doing that as well? And having that framework in place of actually doing it, I think showing value up front is about getting involved in the business outcomes and being able to really drive some of the business outcome, the business transformation, the business plan, and also the business case to actually do it. And then be able to show, well, these are the steps. This is why we're going to go and do it, and this is why we will save money as we go along the way as well, and also be successful. Now, some of that is about being really clear, being really concise in terms of what's actually being done. And then the next question comes, well, to your point, transformation money, things always run out of money. Always run out of money. And therefore people go, well, how do we bring the cost back down? And again, I've been there, where people have gone, well, the architects have done the design now. They can go because we're just doing it. But then there's two bits which then fall onto that, and working with lots of transformation directors, and the ones who know, and we keep it in place, is one of, well, over a transformation weekend, things always change, things always go wrong, things always need to be there, and you need people to still look at the big picture in terms of, well, what does that mean if we do that, rather than just pulling switches in a random way. The second one is that understanding what's being delivered and putting that top level, are we still aiming towards the goal, and moving almost into that governance type role in there. But then that's the assurance of the capability of, are we just doing it the simple way because it's a bit easier, or are we actually still in there in terms of what's actually being done, in terms of what's happening there too?
Okay, makes absolute sense. And this is why it's really hard for me to understand why businesses don't see architecture's value, because as we touched on earlier, they live in the future. A good architect lives in the future and is able to predict to a certain extent what's going to happen. So therefore your chance of failure reduces significantly because you're able to see. And getting an or setting up an architecture practice to, I think, as you said, near 50, but at any given time it was definitely around sort of more 25 to 30 people. I think we've spoken in the past how you can see engineers make that step into architecture quite well. And I've seen it work really well at times, and I've also seen it work not so well, where an engineer is doing it for the wrong reasons. One of the reasons, having spoken to a number of, what then going to become software architects to then solution architects, if they do well, is they're doing it because they don't want to manage people. They don't want to step into that tech lead software development manager, so on and so forth, but they still want to be really, really close to tech.
Yeah.
How did you do that career development and get that buy-in from engineers to move them into an architecture? Because they've got to be the will before anything else.
I think there's a few things here, and let me step back a point to answer your question first, right?
Sure.
Because there's always that inflection point, I think, of when you have a principal engineer and an application architect or whatever, and actually, if you look at their job on the ground, it's very, very similar, and almost people go, well, one or the other, what do we actually want to do? The first thing I'd say is the difference between the two roles isn't almost what they do, it's how they think about it. And I think that's the inflection point to start with. So I would say an engineer tends to come from how we build it bottom up. How do we actually put the components in to actually do it? Where once you actually swap around into an architecture mode, you start going into how do we do it top down, starting with the outcome and actually driving it down in there to actually do it. Now, one of the big points I've always done is, look, this is about communicating and being clear. So to start with, having a very clear career structure in place of what is expected from an objectives and career goals of the architecture role to be able to actually do it. The second bit is also to be very clear at to go through the architecture process and the definition, what needs to be done to be successful and how it needs to be done at all points in time. Now, by doing that, you also get into this position of architects don't need to do architecture. And that's a really key point, because it's good to get some of the engineers to still be doing some of the designs and the architecture type work and the capability. And in some cases, they learn a lot and then see, do they want to do that or not as they go forward? Mm-hmm. And there is always a massive danger of, well, the architect does that, we'll throw that over the wall, they can do that bit rather than that. And it's always, in reality, if you're being successful, a blended mix, And as people go through that career mix, they don't just stop being an A and become a B. Yep. They tend to blend between the two in terms of where they actually are and what they're doing. And by doing that, you start getting the structures in place and the understanding and giving people the, if you like, the scaffolding to make that step forward in terms of what they do and how they can do it in there as well.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd also add one more point, Mario, to this too, of if people want to move into architecture to not do line management, as you say, line management, no, you don't, but you probably don't do it as much until you get to my level and so on as well. But I always say all architects are player managers to a degree.
Yep.
Because while you may not be managing from a line management point of view, you are matrix managing all the time. To be a successful architect, you are working with the engineering team, you are working with the project managers, you are doing that, and you're doing some of that management across the piece to actually take everybody along. So actually, from that soft skill capability, it's probably harder moving into that role than actually becoming a line manager, to be honest with you, because you've got to do it without almost a, but I'm your boss, just do it type capability in there. Yeah.
And it's the same soft skills, isn't it? It's everything that a manager does, but as you say, you can't pull the manager card out. You've got to do this because I'm your boss. Not that well, I hope no managers pull that card out.
Well, you'd hope so.
yeah. But behind the scenes, mentally, there is that. Okay. Going to move on to something that I believe from our previous conversations you're really passionate about, and that's the role of a chief architect. So if we start with in your opinion, what is the role of a chief architect?
So I think the chief architect role is one, it sits at an enterprise level and really understands that we're talking about transformation on this podcast. And really, the chief architect's job is to understand not a transformation, but that enterprise level transformation in terms of the outcomes which is trying to be met in maybe that 3-5 year horizon in terms of what's needed to be going. And therefore, trying to make sure that each of the individual transformation pieces in there starting to move you towards that goal in terms of where you go. So there's that full transformation in there as well. The chief architect very much is an influencer at the exec board, at the exec team, the capability, being able to actually then show what's actually happening, hold a strategy and a technology strategy together in terms of which fits into the overall business strategy and make sure that that actually works, but also is able to feed back in the other way that capability of what can we do and some of the technical problems we've got, and turn those technical problems into business speak, so therefore people understand the value of it as well.
Okay.
I think within there, it's then being able to define the programs and projects of work which need to be done in order to actually make that fit into some of that product evolution. If you're a product company, in terms of how they actually go into them as well, and there's some of the roadmaps and some of the longer term roadmaps which actually fit together. Again, not as a product manager on that day-to-day bit, but in terms of the vision in there. But also then that cultural change of people as well, in terms of skills and capability in there as well, of being able to drive some of those, what we just talked about, of are we all going in the right direction? Are we making some of that capability in place as well? The process maturity, making sure we've got good processes in place, making sure that they actually feed in place and we're actually following that consistently in terms of what's actually going on. And finally, getting involved in making sure that partner landscape is fully understood. Who are we working with? Why are we working with them? How they fits together. Again, those synergies and that capability across, again, the whole enterprise in terms of how that actually works.
Okay. What's the difference, in your opinion, between a chief architect and a head of architecture? And I know job titles, by the way, aren't necessarily everything to go at, but there is a trend when you see job adverts and people doing the job around what they're doing differently to each other. What do you think the difference is?
And I think we've spoken about this offline. I mean, job titles at the moment are so fluid and so random compared to what people want. It's not the go-to in there. My definition would be, if you're a head of architecture, there's probably an architecture practice, and you are an architect yourself, and you are managing that type of capability in the business. It's probably you're the first architect in the business sort of thing, and the most senior in terms of where it is. But there's probably an architecture practice to one side in terms of where that is. If you're a chief architect, I'd say the difference is you're still doing that. You're still managing the architecture team, and that may be directly or indirectly, depending on different hierarchical structures in companies. But also, you've got chief in your name for a reason in there. While you're unlikely to be sat on the exec team, you are still influencing into those exec guys. You're still influencing to the other stakeholders and the other pieces of business of actually driving towards those business outcomes, and also helping to define what those business outcomes should actually be in terms of where they are. So you are not managing an architecture team, but you are driving the entirety of the architecture and the endeavors of the company in terms of where they should actually get to.
Okay. So how is, again, in your opinion, a lot of what you said around the role of a chief architect and the role of a head of architecture fall, for me personally, into the CIO, CTO, regardless of the, again, job title, but the number one technology person in the business. A lot of what you said there falls into their job. Why is it any different to those roles?
So let me start by, in my head, clarifying what a CIO and a CTO is, because again, lots of flow. So simply, and I'm overly simplifying it, of course, a CIO is an internal looking technology leader in the business, i.e. they own all the business systems or the capability or the infrastructure needed to actually make the business run in itself. A CTO is almost I'd say an external looking one, in terms of if you are a technology business creating products or services in there, the CTO scope is the creation of those services in there in terms of where it actually is.
Okay.
I would also then, what I'd say because I tend to work better in that CTO, chief architect space rather than the CIO space, because I find it more interesting. Not having to go at people in that space, but that's where my interest is around. I almost look at it in two ways. It's a bit like why you have a CEO and a COO in a company. One is external looking, talking to the market, talking to the capability in terms of where it is, and one is internal looking, making sure that the business is actually following that and actually taking it through in terms of what's there. And that's what I'd say is the first bit of a CTO to the chief architect view. The second bit is, if you look at the scope of a CTO, the scope of a CTO not only includes the technology strategy as it goes forward, but the day-to-day, is the product operating? Is it working? Is the service capability in there? Is the projects delivering in terms of what's actually in there as well? I'd say the chief architect's job is that forward-looking bit in there. The two roles work hand in glove. Sometimes there's only one role in there as well in terms of how it fits together. But that's where I'd see it. The CTO job has just more scope on that day-to-day operational delivery side of it as well, rather than just the forward-thinking side of it too.
Okay, that makes absolute sense. Why do you enjoy being a chief architect so much, Steve?
I think why I enjoy it so much is it really gives you that ability to understand how a business actually works. And it often, as a chief architect, I'm one of the only people in a business who actually knows what everything's going on in there, because you interact with all the products, all the services, all the capability, all the different stakeholders, and actually understand all the different bits in there. So it's one of those roles where you get a really good view of what's going on within the company and can therefore make a difference in terms of how that actually works, for good or bad, and actually understanding where it is and being able to then connect people together in terms of where it is. I'd say the chief architect role is a real super connector job. If going back, if you don't like talking to people, if you if you think it's just a techie role where you can be introverted and sit in a corner and not do it at all, you're probably not doing the job right, because a lot of it is about getting out there and actually talking to it. And I am an introvert, by the way, and I've had to force myself to communicate to people in the right way as time's gone on. It also really lets you drive good value in a business in terms of what's actually there, drive people forward, drive decisions making forward, drive the maturity in the organization, not just from a technology point of view.
If done well, obviously. That's
if it's done well, yeah. I mean, like any role which has any gravitas in any company, done poorly, can absolutely kill a company. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about the role of the chief architect. For you, what does the first 90 days look like in a chief architect role?
Well, there's a few things I'd set up in terms of where it is. I mean, the first thing I'd say to anybody before I even get into what you do is, the really first bit is to go and listen to people and hear people of what the current state actually is. Yeah, it's really, really important. And you normally have to sit on your hands a little bit to let that listening happen, because the people who will come and talk to you on day one tend to be the noisy people. They're not always the right people who you need to be talking to. So you need to be able to go and do that as well. But I think generally speaking, there's several things I do. So let me spend a bit of time walking through them. But first, you have to understand where the outcomes of the business is going, what needs to be done, and so on in there as well. And therefore, the first thing I'd look to try and do is to set some clear and concise principles actually be needed. So therefore, everybody can buy into them. And when we're making decision making as we go forward, we can go to the principles and go, are we following the principles in terms of why we're making decisions? Now, they can be very simple things like, we will use Microsoft first, we will do this, but people can lay on to that, and it's important. Don't make them too big, no more than maximum of 10, I would say in there, but make sure that you have those clear. And it's great when then people start playing back to you, oh, I can't do that because I'm doing that because I'm following this principle here. The second bit is then to define that simple view of a current and target landscapes in terms of where you actually want to go to. And this is that sort of bigger picture in terms of where it is. And I'm not talking about the sort of strings and wires type level, but that big box type view of, here are the things which make up the current landscape. Here are the things we want to get to. And therefore, here are the bits we need to transform. And also then do that by actually showing some of the value or the cost associated with what, if we don't change, this is costing us this. And that it may not just be in money terms, it may be in time, effort, operational cost in terms of where it is. And then that sort of links into the decisions as you go forward of how you can actually, what steps you need to make and the transformation programs needed to actually do them, and also helps with some of the decision making around, well, how do you do this, and get into is it a buy, build, acquire, partner type step in order to actually move these forward in terms of where they are. The third bit I talk about is then putting in place the wider processes and practices in there, the ADM, the architecture design method, for better way, in terms of where it fits, how that works together, and how it interacts with the rest of the business on those touch points and so on as well. It's always usually important as part of that then to create and manage an approved technologies list. Always good. You become procurement's best friend very early on if you actually do this as well, which is always a really, really critical piece of this too. It drives some synergy in cost, but more than that, it also drives the, look, if you have synergy, if you're using the same technology in multiple places, it's better to do training. You can get that cost, you get that reuse, you get that help with procurement, you get better deals out of people, and all of that leads to an increase of quality, an increase of technical debt management in terms of where you actually are, and you lower the complexity of the business because of where you're actually targeting. I'd also then put in place an early engagement process to steer. I see too many design boards which are at the end of a process when it's too late. You need to be able to steer early on when a project is first initiating, put that in place, and what you do is then you use that in order to hold people to account. Well, not hold people to account because it's a steering, not an approval, but actually, are we following the principles? Are we following the approved technologies list? Are we doing this? And the answer to that could always be no. And if people can explain why, you can then go and change some of those other things, but at least you're doing it early, and therefore change is easier to do. Next one is then the design assurance. Of course, you've still got to put that best practice and design assurance in place to make sure that as things are being delivered, it's still following the capability in terms of where it is. I'd then say, so there's sort of the practical bits in there, but then the other bit, you need to get into some of those soft skills and capability. It's really important you put a career structure and start doing that with very clear objectives for the team, and not just the objectives for the architecture team, but also make it really clear when all the bits of the business are engaging, what you expect, what you get, what you don't get, and so on from an architecture group in terms of where it is, how that will work, how that will work in there as well. Define that horizontal and vertical structure, the mesh structure in terms of how it works in there as well. And the stuff we talked about earlier, that how you can promote from within, how you can move people along those lines. It's always really important, you in your recruiter hat, you have a really clear JD, for each of the roles in there. You remove smoke and mirrors of how you actually get promoted in the business. If you're bringing somebody in, you know where they fit, how you fit into there. I love something like Sophia, for example. I think it's, it's got problems with it, but it's a really good structure to actually help pin into different roles. And then people always know where they're going. Also then introducing technology horizon scanning. Really, really important to put in there. One of the jobs of the chief architect and so on as well, to actually then feed into that target. What technology is coming? Are any of them threats? Are some of them opportunities? How do they actually fit in there as well as we actually go forward? And then that links also to the right tech partners. Why are we going with those people? How are we fitting? You see how some of these are then joining together.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, and probably the most important thing, is communication. None of the above works if you are not communicating it in a really, really clear way.
Yeah.
And also consistently, and to the point where everybody is bored of you saying the same things. I want people to be dreaming about the stuff in terms of how we do it and so on as well, and everybody's on the same page. So it's important to use all the tools there, town halls, getting people together, them listening, talk through where we're going, while we're going there. One-to-ones, again, really, that one-to-one structure for both those soft skills, that career progression, but also problems we can unblock, how we actually do that as well. And it's about keep communicating, and it has to be in two ways as well. You can't just be broadcasting, this is what we're doing. You have to be able to listen back and being able to adjust and being able to show you will adjust if people have good ideas, because that's how you build the trust and the people wanted to talk back into that architecture practice and capability in there as well.
A really good structure for anybody joining. I think I counted nine or 10 points in there. So fantastic. What do you think the threats are of the architect role? I put that in inverted commas, because we are seeing businesses remove architecture as a practice, as I said earlier, put it within the engineering job description or roles and responsibilities. We're seeing less and less people at the C-suite come from an architecture background. So, as you said earlier, a good CIO knows the value of architecture, or good CTO. There's people that don't. So what are the threats of an architecture role, and how can as an industry or as a practice we overcome them?
I think the first threat I'd talk about is a bit of a catch-22, unfortunately, which is the architects tend to, as I said earlier, live in that non-functional world in terms of making sure those things work. And therefore, you're looking about, is security in place? Is a reliability in place? Is that in place? The big threat of all of that is doing it properly costs money. Yeah. I.e., you adding more security layers in there, i.e., you adding redundancy in terms of how things work in there as well. And the catch-22 is, the better the job you've done it, the less likely something is to go wrong. And the less likely something is to go wrong means the exec team and the board and so on forget about it. You always can get loads of money to do stuff if once you've just had a security incident. Once you've just had an outage, which is taking your customers down for 3 days, suddenly everybody's interested in those non-functionals in terms of how they work and so on and stuff like that. When you're doing it right and you don't have those incidents, it just looks like a cost to your COGS type capability in terms of what you're actually doing. Therefore, you need to be talking about it all the time. You need to be talking about the fact that we haven't had security incidents, we haven't had this, and also then linking that back to things like, the risk of GDPR if you have a data leak type capability in there, and therefore it's costing us this to do this in terms of where it is. But also then putting the other options on the table for people as well, going, we can reduce this, we can go down these bits in here too. But are you prepared to take the risk in there too? The other side of that is a bit of a tricky one too, is also talking about, do you get value for it? Because making your product more reliable than the next man's product is only worth it if your customers are buying your product because they know that.
For reliability,
Do they care? If you go from 95 to 99 to 4 nines, 5 nines, 6 nines, whatever it is, are they prepared to pay that extra money in order to do it because there's value to them? And if there is, make sure that's part of your sales pitch and your capability in there as well. And then that really then brings that architecture value to the fore, and the salesman is sort of going, well, we win deals because of this. And if not,
why do
understand that, take it out, don't do it for the sake of doing it, and that's where the pragmatism comes in. You lower the architecture principles if that's the case. The other threat is about making unpopular decisions, and this is a chief architect type thing all the time, because you're looking at the vision, where it's going, where it's actually being there. Sometimes you're in that position of, well, why do you want to go and do this?
Yeah.
And it may be people want to go and play with a new shiny bit because the new shiny bit looks there. It's like, well, do we know why we want to do that? We've already got this tool in place which already does it successfully. We don't want to change that. No, we don't want to get diverted by going and doing that thing over there. We need to stay focused here and there as well. And that comes back down to communication as well, because yes, you're still saying no, you're still going, no, we need to focus here, but it's about communicating on why we need to stay the focus in terms of where it is, why we're going, where it actually is. So therefore, getting people bought in on what the outcome is we're trying to drive, rather than the individual decision in terms of where it actually goes in there as well.
Okay.
And then the last one we've already talked about really is this: don't become an ivory tower architecture type thing. Become well, the architects will do that over there. Make sure there's a bleed into the engineers. Make sure that it's not just architects doing architecture. It's a way of thinking and a way of consideration, rather than just there's a team and that team just goes and does it. If you're in that sort of space, that's when people go, but do we really need them or not? Because that's where that sort of comes into there as well.
I like the quote you said earlier: stop the view that architects only do architecture. And I think if every architect has got that mentality, then the value will be able to be demonstrated quite easily. I'm going to move on to our quick fire questions now. We're coming towards the end of 2024 without wishing our lives away, but what do you expect in 2025 will be a game changer from a technology perspective?
I think if I look at the last 18 months, Gen AI has become, everybody talks about it, everybody does it, and so on, in terms of I think there's a reality factor in it, and this is going to be a little bit boring, unfortunately, as an answer. In order to gain the value of what we're seeing in Gen AI and some of that capability, really going back and concentrating on getting those data structures and data context and data cleaning right, getting that fundamental right. While people have been saying it for years, it's more vital than ever. You only get the value out of those AI models and that capability if there's a good foundation to build on. And actually getting that back for data transferability, data usage, AI and speed type models. The businesses that solve that will be able to take that other technology and actually power forward a lot faster than anybody else and have a competitive edge.
Okay, perfect. Any advice you wish you'd received earlier on in your career?
I think the key bit for me, and I say to everybody else, is don't be scared of trying something. If I look back, I would say anything I've regretted has always been when I've not done something, not given something a go, rather than I've tried it. Because even if I've tried something and it's gone wrong, I've tried a slightly different role, I've done something else, and so on as well. You gain so much, you learn so much, and it opens up other opportunities by actually doing it. That actually not doing something, you don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's out there. So give things a go. As long as it's not massively reckless, I'd say. So therefore, you've got a way back out. You're just going to learn extra skills, which are going to make you more valuable in the long run.
Fine. Okay. What's the biggest change you expect to see in the market over the next 5 years from a talent perspective within architecture?
What I'd say is, and I don't think this is, I say this all the time, and I go and do some lectures at one of the universities and so on as well. And I've been banging this message for quite a long time, and I think it's just more of the same, to be honest with you. There's two things which have been changing. The first is we've gone away from a world where you can go and learn some skills, and then those skills will last you for life in terms of where they actually are. The world is changing so quickly that any skill you have today will probably be worthless in 3 years' time in terms of where it is. So actually, that ability to learn, adapt, and continue to learn is more valuable than saying, I can do X, I can do Y. It's the, how did you learn that? How can you quickly pick that up? And how can you do the next bit in there as well? The second bit is, I think the game of one person being able to do stuff has gone away in there. It's not about how good you are. It's about how good you fit into a team and therefore the value you can add to a team. So again, a lot of people will hate me saying this, but those soft skills, massively, massively important. It don't matter how clever you are, if you can't convince anybody else, it's a good thing to do. It's, being able to communicate, being able to go and actually do those things. And I hated it. I thought it was all rough. I won't say what I thought about it because I'll probably broadcast it. But then I had, where my career moved up was when I realised actually there's massive value in doing this and being able to do it successfully.
It's finding a way to be able to assess those soft skills at interview stage, because they're probably just, if not more important than the technical skills. As you say, if you're planning on a 5-year career at that same business, doing that same role, then 3 of those in 3 years' time, what you know now is going to be relevant. So
and as I said before, all architects are man managers as well, and therefore you have to manage those teams. And anybody who's ever interviewed for me will know one of the things I do. I always get people to do a presentation in terms of into an interview, and that's not so much I care about what you're saying. I care about, can you get it across cleanly and clearly. And I usually give people like 20 minutes, and people who can't condense their thoughts into that 20 minutes and get it clearly, the test is, can you do it within that 20 minutes and keep it clear, not about, can you tell me what's actually in the pack?
Fine. Okay.
I've given it away now, haven't I?
Well, sadly, Steve, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for a truly excellent podcast episode. It's been really interesting and great to chat with you about in detail around the role of a chief architect. Thanks so much for it. Thanks for giving us your time today, and I'm sure that the listeners will appreciate it as well.
Well, thank you for spending some time with me. It's always good for people to listen to me without wandering off too bored. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
And that's a wrap. Sadly, we're at the end of another Transformational Blueprints episode. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and there were plenty of golden nuggets for you to take away. If you're a fan of the show, please do remember to share, like, and leave reviews so that more people from our industry get to hear and benefit from these too. Please also follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to keep up to date with new episodes. Links in the show notes. Join us next time for another episode packed with tips and advice from senior leaders in the technology world.